Okay, fine. Okay, so the Shabbos ein lahaziz yesh v'regel b'li rishus. Okay, so nochachot zu kiviyachol b'veit melech. As we are, kiviyachol is the word we use for as if. Kiviyachol means it's as if we are in the house of the king. It means that when we're in the house of the king, we have to have different conduct than we do when we are in the weekday. So that's a good question. It's funny, I was thinking this morning by the laws of Muktzah, the Rambam writes that one of the reasons, and this is not in the Gemara in Shabbos talks about the reason for Muktzah is that you're going to come to use those kalim, like power tools on Shabbos, so therefore they're Muktzah. The Rambam throws in a new reason, which is that we want your hiluchach b'Shabbos should not be hiluchach b'chol. The way you walk and talk and conduct yourself in Shabbos should be different than chol, and therefore things like klei shmalach or vessels that are designed for prohibited activities, right? Those things are off limits on Shabbos. It's the Rambam's additional idea. In that context, he says you might have thought, right, that let's say I don't regularly use power tools during the week because I'm a Jewish guy and I don't know how to use power tools. Let's just say. So then maybe I can use power. I can lift up power tools or drill on Shabbos because it's not going to look like I'm doing something that I do during the week. And he says, no, it's shav l'chol adam. Whatever would be standard, klish machta isser is a standard prohibited vessel for everyone. And so you're asking, what if on Shabbos, right? What was the question again? What if right? And then what was the question? It was a follow-up question. What happens? Oh, so why don't we have, right. So there has to be, it's not just an awareness of God, it's also about Shabbos being noticeably a different day. In order to express that Shabbos is the day then we really feel that experience, and it has to be different. And practically you have to do work during the week. You have to build, you have to work. So the same theme applies, that distinction, right? Of malacha, of prohibited activities, of conduct, of speaking, of the way we dress, all of that has to be different on Shabbos because it follows all of the halachas. Okay, so how about Yisif Shabbos Eitzel Min Rabosai? We're going to talk about Yosef Lis Zatzal. He was by a Rebbe of his. Marati, the Dibarti, only Jews say he was by this person. By this person. Nobody else says that. Would anyone else say, I was by the market? Right, because it's Yiddish. By is Yiddish. It's not English. But doesn't mean next to. Okay? Other people would not know what you're talking about when you say it, right? So daven for the Amud, right? I mean, you're davening for the Amud. Davening for a Shender? So it's no before, but it's Yiddish. Right? Okay, so anyway, so Pama Yisi b'Shabbos Eitzel Echad Min Rabosai Amarati v'Dibarti Ito Liyad Hageder Shel HaChatzer. We're standing by the courtyard by a fence, next to a fence. Toch Kidei Sicha B'li Lasim Leiv Tachti v'Sigarti Es Shar Chatzer. I wasn't paying attention, but I opened up the fence and closed it in the middle of the conversation. Fidgeting, I guess. So what are you doing? I'm not doing anything. I'm just playing around, right? Fidget. Opening the fence, closing the fence, right? You're talking and you pluck a leaf off of a tree. You're not paying attention. What are you doing? You're doing something. I'm not doing anything. Samti lev lepeta shiadi potachot v'sogrot et hashar. I was opening and closing the gate without paying attention to what I was doing. Azu omerli v'dalacha etzli lo shayach shikra davar kazeh. By me, it doesn't happen that I open and close things without paying attention. Yadayim sheli yazuzu b'Shabbos b'li shum b'li she'eda mahen b'diuk osos. I never am in a situation where my hands are busy doing things that I don't know exactly what I'm doing. Yodea tamadua, and you know why? Ali Saba Chassid Kotzk. I had a chassid of Kotzk who was my grandfather. Nadum Gadol Zichroni. Shekol Erev Shabbos Mechados Ve'elach. Hayadayim Shelo Hayu Matchilos Lirod. His hands would start to tremble right before Shabbos. Lefsiku Milirod. Took him to the doctor. He had Parkinson's. No. Lirod Ad Seis HaShabbos. And he didn't stop until the end of Shabbos. So Kishiganu Elav Levakro B'Shabbos. Visitor goes my Mistaka Rak Al Hayadayim Shalom. Hechan Yadayim, Hechan Yadayim. You kept looking at our hands. Where are your hands? That on Shabbos he was mindful of what his hands were doing. That's an interesting thing, right? We teach ourselves to be mindful of our speech. We teach ourselves to be mindful of our young kids, hopefully mindful of their bodies, and where they're present and whether they're making contact with people that are appropriate, inappropriate. Are you standing too close? Are you standing far away? And if you don't learn those things, then it develops habits that are just simply inappropriate. But your hands, simply fidgeting with things. Now we've developed a whole line of toys that are designed. Kids should always be doing things that are not mindful, right? And there was a shaila that Rav Asher Weiss was asked when the fidget toys were popular: is, are you allowed to hold a fidget toy during tefillah? That was the question. Can you daven holding a spinner? Okay, so in addition to that, that's a good question. But forget about the fact that holding something might, other than a sitter, would be considered a distraction. What about a fidget toy? And if I'm not mistaken, one of the things that he writes is that having a fidget toy is actually going to it's going not just distract you, but it creates a sense of dual focus, right? And I wanted to suggest that on that it's actually takes us away from the idea of mindfulness. Fidget toys are mindlessness, and that whatever we're engaged in, we have to be focused on that item. Could you imagine you're talking to someone? Well, we can imagine. And what are you doing in the conversation? It took me so long, and I'm still really bad at it, but to not have this thing around when I'm talking to someone, it's so difficult.
When my
because
kids come to talk to me, people want to talk to me, we'll be on the phone.
Right.
When they come, I can.
Right. It's great, and that's a start. You could also move it further away. Now they have an extra screen on the back that shows you different things, like or your watch will show you. Oh, I got a text message, right? So it's. I figured out how to get rid of the phone during davening, and then I started getting emails and text messages on my watch. So I think my watch.
In teaching, they love the kids use fidget toys.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether from a therapeutic standpoint, actually there is a benefit. I'm sure it might be. Right. They have to stay balanced. And, it causes you to. Right. So I actually want to get rid of WhatsApp altogether. I'm thinking about it because I can't tolerate distraction. I can't be focused on anything. I'm not present. So if I got rid of WhatsApp, the volume of people reaching me would be limited to the people who really want to reach me, as opposed to all of the groups that I'm part of where everybody has to send me the latest meme about Trump. Like, I just don't care. You don't have to do it all. You can, but it's showing up, and there's a flag, and it's telling you better read this. So yeah, there is control, but then you could put together a commitment device for yourself where you say, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to be part of that anymore. I can live a life, and if someone needs to reach me, they will call me or text me or email me. And that's 3 ways to reach me. It's really convenient, and it becomes very hard. So I don't know how to, I'm not saying I have a solution. I'm just saying I want to do it. Right. So there are people in my life who I can't reach. And I'm sure for some people, I'm the person they can't reach. And that's just, you draw a line. You say, I just cannot be accessible all the time. cannot be reachable all the time. Because if I am, I'm not present. I'm never anywhere. I'm everywhere, and therefore I'm nowhere.
Right.
So that's one of the things we have here. It says, at least look at your hands. And I'm reminded of that story that I've shared in the past, that the story about a student has their Otniel, and he was in a lecture that was being delivered by his Rebbe. His Rebbe is Rav Yaakov Nagain. I've had the pleasure of meet on occasion, and he's a great author and he's a great thinker. He's out of the box. His name was originally Rabbi Yaakov Jack Genack. His real name became Yaakov Nagain. Rabbi Genak's nephew, I think it is, and he's a very well-known educator in Israel. And he's a Ram in Otniel. And he writes in one of his books, Rebbe Choyom, that he was teaching about the importance of learning how to use your hands b'kedusha. And the Kohen has to wash his hands and his feet before he does avoda. And he asked his Talmidim, why do you think the Kohen always has to wash his hands? It was like OCD, right? If you look at the Mishnayos and Yoma now, they change their clothing, gold and white clothing 5 times back and forth. They go to the mikveh 5 times and wash their hands before and after each one. So it's 10 times washing your hands and feet. That's correct. It's correct. So why? Why do you always wash your hands? And why in general does he do avoda before he does it? Does he wash his hands before he does avoda? So one of the Talmidim said, his name is Noam Apter, and he raised his hand. He said, I think that the Kohen has to do a lot of very fine motor movements and very fine different things, scooping up the flour and shechting this and sprinkling this and the thumb and that. And therefore, because the avoda requires manipulation and movement of those hands, right, fine movements, dexterity, you have to sanctify those hands that are engaged in those very fine movements, because each one is very unique. Mm-hmm. And so an act of sanctification allows for mindfulness and focus. And that's what he suggested. And he said that years later, when there was a terrorist attack in Otniel, and the terrorists burst into the kitchen, and there were 2 or 3 boys in the kitchen duty doing Torah Nut, and everybody else was in the Chader Ochel. I think they were singing Shalom Aleichem. They had finished davening. Hundreds of students sitting in the Chader Ochel. Terrorists burst into the kitchen. The one who was in charge there was shot in the stomach. Stomach injuries are really difficult to overcome, and they're very painful. He crept up to the door. He locked the door. He moved the key, and he threw away the key, creating a barrier between the terrorists and the hundreds of students. He was killed. They found by this student, whose name was Noam Apter, that boy, they found that he had opened up his holster for his gun. And he had gone for the gun to try to defend him. He wouldn't have stood a shot against the 3 of them. It would not, and the weapons they had. He wouldn't have lasted. But he had thought about it. Yeah, I think so. He had thought about it. In that moment, he unholstered it, and he instead crept with a stomach injury towards the door to find the key to get rid of it. It was a decision he made in the moment with his hands and with his feet. And Rabbi Nagain writes that student already understood from an earlier lesson that Kedusha, sanctity, means the understanding of that each fine movement of the fingers and hands and feet requires great thoughtfulness, great presence. And that when you move and you fidget and you move like that, when you're mindless with those hands, you can't do great things. That's why the Kohen sanctifies his hands. He knew that, and that's how he gave his life. And this is the story here, I think, that you have a story of his Rebbe who would shake on Shabbos his hands because he understood that how could you be opening and closing a door? Who fidgets, right? We used to do these things that my father would teach us, fidget with the hand, these things like this, right? Why are we doing these fidgets? Why are we doing things with our fingers all the time that are just mindless, right? And one of the signs of certain medications and certain numbing medications and certain illnesses, mental illnesses, our hands are doing all sorts of things all the time. Now, certain medications do that to you. My father, right? My father used to run the dental clinic for the Bronx Psychiatric Hospital. And we would often we drive from something to work. We'd go meet him there. And I would say, why are all of the clients who work there, why are they always doing this? All the time, everyone, he said, well, they're all on certain medications to their hands. So that means that something is numbing your cognitive process, right? Because with the hands, it's again, there are all sorts of illnesses that happen, but it's really difficult to be that precise. And so this is what he's describing. I saw he was doing that. The Seder Doros, and in the book Seder Doros from the Geonim, Muva Maise Mufla Benogea Lesod Zeh Shel Omed Lifnei Hamelach. This secret was brought down already of what does it mean to stand before the king. Maise Rebbe Bostanai. Story of Rebbe Bostanai. I love that name. Boston or Rebbe, but this is in the from the Geonim. It's long before there was a Rebbe, long before the Baal Shem Tov was a Havamina, let alone his great descendant. Ma sheba liYisrael al yado v'al asher chosmin based David bechosmo tzuras zevuv. Yigadel bostanai, yigadel v'yilmod Torah u'Mishnah Talmud halacha chachma tfuna v'yugad lemelech v'yit'u lir'oto v'yitzav laviu elav v'yimshoch lo lakim chasto mehod chesed asher leDavid yamod lefanav al hanar. As I translation here, I am. So 190. So story goes like this. There was a man named Rav Bostanai, descendant of David Melech, and while he was young, he became renowned for his wisdom and Torah knowledge. The king was interested in seeing this wonder child and summoned him to the royal court. The king and his advisors were impressed with the lad who stood there before them until nightfall without turning his head even slightly or lifting his foot. After a while, a fly began buzzing around and settled on the lad's forehead. He didn't bat an eyelash. The fly started to bite him and draw blood. He didn't raise his hand to brush it away. The king found it rather strange. Why don't you brush away the fly? The lad answered, we have a hallowed tradition in our family that when in the presence of the king, one doesn't lift a hand or foot without the king's permission. The king was pleased by the lad's answer. He accorded him with great honor and made the fly that family's insignia. That is what Shabbos Kodesh is like. Someone who has learned Hilchos Shabbos well, especially the laws of Muktzah, knows that on Shabbos it's almost impossible to lift a hand or foot without the permission of our great king. If a person picked up his hand and is not aware of what he is doing, he is likely to desecrate Shabbos. Why? Because he's in the presence of the king. What an incredible story from the Geonim. I will add one thing, that is that that this is not a show I necessarily recommend watching from a Yiddish perspective, a Jewish perspective, but something that certainly there are a lot of lessons in the great show Breaking Bad. There is an entire episode in which he is in his methamphetamine lab. He is dealing with a fly. Fly is the sign that contamination has gotten into the lab, which is a whole sort of Beis Hamikdash analogy. It was never based on a fly in a zvuv in the Beis Hamikdash, the first Beis Hamikdash, according to Gemara and Yoma. One of the many miracles and distinctions between the first Beis and the second Beis was the first Beis never had a fly, despite all the dead meat. Having been to a shechtas, I can tell you there were myriads of flies. Never a fly. So he's in the lab and he's trying to hunt down this fly the entire time. And of course, hijinks, he's tripping on a ladder and this, but in this entire episode, a very intense show. Super intense, super serious drama that is filled with moments that are not for the faint of heart. And this entire episode is hunting down a fly, and it ends up being some of the most incredible television that's ever been filmed. And what is it really about? So the man is so unhappy with his reality, his life, that a little fly disturbs him and ruins his entire. Right, it's straight out of Bugs Bunny, right? Straight out of Elmer Fudd Can't Handle the Rabbit, right? You've got everything, and a fly is going to ruin your. And again, he doesn't have everything, but of course, he's dying, and he's and he's running a drug empire. But in terms of his success as this cook, he's achieved that success, and finally, this fly is his undoing. And you think about what the Medrash Lahavdil is telling us, what this from the Gaonim, the story about a person who did not allow that to undermine his focus. What was he on? What was he working on? And that I think is an appropriate analogy to bring up. Well, just one last paragraph here. So that is the idea about the fly, and Zehirus Michal Shabbos Kiddush Hashem, care of Chol Shabbos. Hakpada zu shelo lahaziz yad or regel shaser. This idea that we don't move our leg or hand when it's usher. Yesh ba gam kiyu mitzvah tzuma shel Kiddush Hashem. There's actually a mitzvah Kiddush Hashem. The Rambam writes in Yesodei Torah in the 5th chapter, Mevar berachova es mitzvahs Kiddush Hashem mitoch dvar vanu lemeidim sheyeshnam shlosha chalakim lekiddush Hashem. There are 3 parts to Kiddush Hashem. Echad laharig al Kiddush Hashem. One is to be killed for the sake of Hashem, if you have to be, right? We don't want that, but it's a mitzvah if it has to be done. Sheni chova al kol Yehudi v'yag lisnag b'nimus derech eretz, to have derech eretz, to be proper, to be nimusi is like etiquette, mannered. Kol echad lefi dargato shechalilu lo yomru hinei adati asot minai bechos derech eretz, to say, oh, look at that from Jew, look at them, they're cutting lines. Look how the from Jews behave. We don't want anyone to ever say such a thing. Because of that, you have a special guest. Some of our participants in our shiurim get visited by rebbeim in yeshivas during their shiurim. So anyone who is over bidaito, sorry, I skipped. So I was in the Hebrew. I apologize. I was in the Rambam. The Rambam writes that it's on page Kuf Samach Beis that there are 3 portions. Number 1 is what? My car. Okay. Have fun. I'm leaving in 5 minutes, but yeah. Okay. That is a great gadget. Push a button and it moves. Backs the car up on the. Oh yeah, Hyundai likes to amp up the gadgets. That's their thing. More than like a lot of the Korean cars, they focus on that stuff. As opposed to an engine that actually works. But they're great. I like gadgets. So what are the things? So the Rambam writes that there are 3 levels of Kiddush Hashem. 1 is to give your life for Hashem. Number 2 is that every Jew has to conduct himself, that they have to worry about Chil Hashem. No one should ever say, look at that religious person, look how they behave. The higher you are in your spiritual madriga, the more you have to be careful about your conduct. Es Hashem, you are my servant, and I will glorify myself with you. And the third part, the Rambam says, of Kiddush Hashem is not just giving up your life or conducting yourself like Kiddush Hashem, because if you're in the public and someone's going to see the person with a yarmulke, what are they doing? But the third one is kol over midaito below onus alchad mikol mitzvos amoros betorosh b'shat b'nefesh hachis hareze mechalas Hashem. Anyone who violates Hashem's will without being forced to do so is a mechal Shem Shemayim. If you weren't forced to do a sin and you did it, and as this is Posh Ma'avera or Asa Mitzvah, that's Mekashim Hashem. So a person who observes the mitzvos or doesn't violate them, right, without being forced, is Mekashim Shemayim. Every mitzvah a person does. But does it for the sake of heaven. Except for what you do to fulfill mitzvah. So every time you're living a life of mitzvos, you're living a life of Kiddush Hashem. For example, Shabbos in the morning. So a Baal Nimsa guesses let's say the husband goes to shul. The children are playing in the backyard, in the courtyard. Woman is in the kitchen. Okay, you can infer your cultural norms from here. Ulupeta nishpach eza rotev ala ritzba, and sauce has spilled on the floor. He meheret lechapes mashul, and I gave it the rotev. She runs quickly to bring up a shmata to right. He rolled the front of Galil shel nir sofag. She sees a sponge, right? Paper towel, sorry, paper towel, nir sofag, paper towel. Val Shabbos is losh. She can't rip it on Shabbos. Echad l'ros, but no one's going to see. No one's going to see you rip it. Imu tatchil lechapes b'chol habayis ezum magevet yeshno and ageving ima harotav hashomni yitpashet al pnei kol mitpach. It's going to spread. Aval hi yodat zachar shekadosh baruch hu, but God sees. Kadosh baruch hu tziva zachar yom shabbat kadsho. He mitgaberet moshechet et yadea megalil shel haniyar sofeg. What does she do? She quickly takes her hand away from it. You know what kind of gevura that takes, right? And that and by the way, or a spill on your shirt on Shabbos. Not to take the seltzer. It's in your Jewish DNA from the time your great grandparents were born and near the pickle shop in the Lower East Side. You knew that you're supposed to put seltzer on a shirt on a stain. That's what Jews always did those times. Anyway, Osa Isha Gilvad Masha Kaima is a mitzvah Shabbos. He kaima od mitzvah chashuva. That's Kiddush Hashem. That's the third level, and that is control of one's actions and monitoring where one puts their hands and their time. That kind of mastery, though, you don't have to deal with terrorists in the kitchen. That kitchen scenario that we described there is also a moment of Kiddush Hashem, and we should be. I don't think he knew about that story, but.